So world building comes out of the film industry, where I worked for a while. But it's also a term that is absolutely common in game and interactive media. So we're really looking at how you fold together these complex practices that have been really separated for generations. And really allow us to sort of start applying what we've learned mostly in entertainment media to the real world.
I was a painter at Central School of Art in London in 1975. I shifted almost immediately from being a painter to kind of using my art skills to do graphics and music, doing record sleeves. And that evolved into music videos. Fairly quickly after that, I started working with directors and discovered that term, production designer. So I production designed Lawnmower Man first, then The Crow, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, then Fight Club, and then came Minority Report, and the writer Scott Frank and I started on the same day. And without a script, we had to develop a world, and that really changed my practice completely. You know, Steven's directive was to create future reality, not science fiction. We had to kind of gather our information, our data, our research from the real world, from laboratories and corporations and architects and urban planners. There are now over 100 patents that can be associated with Minority Report. Things like driverless cars, which was the transportation system that we have imagined that cars could move horizontally and vertically. We weren't being so clever, we were just listening well. And we were using that information that we're discovering to trigger the imagination. Imagining and portraying something that doesn't really yet exist in the world was a way to actually enable it to exist in the world. In every film that I did from then on, even if there was already a script, I was trying to break down a coherent, logical way to see how the world connects, to drive all of the kind of incremental details of that world. So world building is about understanding a world deeply enough in all of its aspects that stories spring almost effortlessly from that base world.
So that's just a kind of overview of the history. I want to tell a little story. I started teaching at the University of Southern California in 2012. My first round of students included this young man, Patrick Meegan. So he was an interactive media student working in games. For his thesis project, he built the first 360-degree camera, I believe, with GoPros, which he strapped to his head like a crown, and then made a movie, which was based on a theater piece. So it was almost impossible to define what his skill set was, or how he would talk about himself. So we talked about it a little bit, and I suggested that he call himself an art scientist. He went out into the world with that on his business card and landed a job at Jaunt, which is the #1 360 camera company in the world now, as creative director, which is what he is now. So essentially this rig that he's showing almost 10 years later, 8 years later, comes directly from a thesis project he did where he kind of ignored the boundaries of discipline and just dove into what his vision actually was. This leads me to kind of the fundamental idea of what we do, which is storytelling, visual storytelling. This is a very low-tech history of storytelling. So if we believe that the very first stories came from the human tribe, and they were designed to make sense of the world around us, and they used the idea of metaphor and storytelling language to develop that. So the moon going across the sky turned into a metaphor, a princess in a chariot, or any number of mythological narratives that developed. And then in 1440, the printing press slams down in Europe, and storytelling becomes extremely linear. In the Western culture, for the last 600 years, you have these individual authors across all media, across art, across photography, theatre, film, and even architecture, where we're waiting for this one person to tell us what to do and what to think, and we remain audience. So we're looking through that sort of proscenium of the theatre and listening to these creative geniuses, which is not to say that they're not creative geniuses, but it removes the idea of community from the creative process to a large extent. What happened to me when I joined USC and started developing this narrative of world building there, I teamed up with the company Intel, and they asked us to basically challenge their chips. How complicated could you make that? And as a process, we started working in virtual reality. And it was immediately clear that linear storytelling does not work in VR or in mixed reality, that you are standing on the stage. So you're no longer audience. Every decision you make when you're standing inside an immersive space is a decision that involves you directly in the story. And every viewpoint and every new person that enters that space becomes another participant in the storytelling. So it really allowed us to think about cycling all the way back to tribal storytelling and starting to think that for us with world building as a base, that we've transitioned into a kind of global narrative that is completely interactive, that allows a huge number of people to participate in a central storytelling idea. So multiple stories develop. We ran an event like this with 300 people. They created 1,000 stories in 3 hours and then started turning those into artifacts. So there's almost no limit to what we can do as a community when we're starting to have our imagination fired by each other. This started for me with the film Minority Report. So Minority Report was unique in my career in that it didn't have a script. So when Steven Spielberg hired me, he hired the writer on the same day. And we worked for about a year without a script in place. So we were kind of forced to develop a world, to develop the context of the story before the story really existed. And so, have any of you seen that film? So in this film, it's a science fiction on the surface with Tom Cruise as a character, a detective who's running through this world. But it's set 50 years in the future, so we really had to imagine architecture, technology, transportation, all of these different elements as completely new, but responding to all of the holistic parts of the world. How do you make a world that's convincing where all of the pieces connect? And one of the things that Steven Spielberg said was, this isn't science fiction, it's future reality. And so we went out into the world and we started doing deep research. We connected with laboratories at Apple, with DARPA, the National Defense people, with MIT Media Lab, all sorts of people who were giving us deep advice about the next sort of 15 or 20 years, and which we translated into a 50-year vision. The result was that Minority Report is spoken about being really prescient, that it had come up with ideas that are gradually, one by one, coming true. But it wasn't that we were being so clever, it was really just that we were listening carefully and listening to experts and gathering experts and seeing how those ideas have developed. So by the end of the film, we had developed ideas of policing that was using predictive methods, voice and face recognition, Internet of Things, driverless cars, gesture interface, personalized advertising like Amazon biomimicry. Things that we're really familiar with now, but in year 2000 when we made that film, were really not known. Thank you, Eric. One of the examples, for example, examples, for example, is how does Tom Cruise get to work in the morning? So he lives at the top of a new city, very high up, and he goes to work in old DC. So we imagined that we would combine an elevator and a taxi cab and create a kind of three-dimensional world where cars could move horizontally and vertically. That in itself is still relatively fictional. We don't have a maglev that's powerful enough to take us up the side of buildings. But it was actually prescient in the sense of driverless cars, which were really being expressed for the first time in this film. The gesture recognition that you saw in the previous image was something that came directly out of research at MIT Media Lab. Once it was in the film, it turned from essentially fiction into fact. So we were starting to affect things in the real world and respond to things in the real world that were just a kind of glimmer in their engineers' eyes. We also developed a process that was completely new, which was to create these low-resolution models, essentially to do urban planning, and then to test and prototype these. This is 3D printed, these two here, they're all being derived from the same data. And so for the first time we were a fully digital art department where the data was being spread across the entire infrastructure of making the film. So the outcome is really that the film, because it built on a world, even though it was a simple, a single story, could have had multiple different viewpoints. We could have looked at it as urban planning. We could have looked at it as an examination of the future of advertising. We could look at it as a way of looking at technology, and as I showed you, a way of looking at mobility. So we have this ability to think about every world now as a coded and interlocking system, a way of just changing your lens in the way that the imagination develops when you have all of these experts gathered around, people like yourself who start talking to each other and new ideas emerge, and then those turn into material outcomes, game, film, any kind of media, and those in turn inspire other people. The process we use, we call the mandala, and I won't get deeply into it, but basically this represents a holistic world. If you imagine this as a slice through a sphere, all of the parts of the world are represented. So you start thinking about the context of the world. If you look at something that's set, 2,000 years ago, the rules of the world are going to be different than a story that's set on Mars. And then you start moving through scale, like what runs the largest scale, the city, the town, the country. What happens when you start moving into neighborhood, into the family or the social group, and then into the individual in the center. So we developed all of the rules of the world by investigating all of these different parts. And then as we move in, we create the characters in the center, and then those characters go back out from the center into the world, and they start, by populating the world, they start to ask the world questions, and we're interrogating the world with the stories we tell. But there's no limit to how many stories you can tell once you approach it this way. We also, so that's the kind of content development. This is the process development. This was a model we built in 2004 to talk about the big shift that was happening in storytelling. So this represents essentially 19th century storytelling that's not changed since Victorian times, completely linear. The script, then the director, and then the director fires the writer and hires another writer, and then the designer starts, and the one thing after another. In this process, which we developed for Minority Report, everybody works together at the same time, and they work in this design visualization space. So you start with very low resolution, as you're going to be doing in the hackathon, and then you start thinking about how it gets more and more high resolution, and as it does, the story develops. And in each case, everybody is testing it. So you go through ideation to prototyping, to capture, to outcome. So the film is made in a really different way. And that's applicable to any scale in any media. So another example, this is the Man of Steel film that we did around 2010, I guess. The question we started with, we were asked to redesign the S logo on the chest, on Superman's chest. The question we asked is, why does he have an S on his chest? He's from Krypton, they don't speak English. So what does that S really represent? And we started diving into that. And we thought, well, maybe it's a symbol for the family that he comes from. And what if there are other symbols? And we started developing a language of the sort of glyphs that represent each of the families in Krypton, essentially the tribal families. And then we started getting carried away, and we thought, well, what if that turned into language? So by the time we'd finished, we developed a complete alphabet and number system and a language which reflected their culture. And then we took that idea of a kind of biological, organic development and took it into the architecture itself of the film. So the graphic language turned into the form language. The rule here was that there's no straight lines on Krypton. Everything was organic. That becomes quite complicated because you can't use any traditional manufacturing processes that represent, right angles. So we did 3D printing of all of these objects, but in order to make it cost effective, you could see actually that this object is the same as this object is the same object. So we created asymmetrical objects, complicated objects that are different from one end to the other, but used them in so many different ways that the process, the set itself, which was built entirely in camera, so it's not CGI, was completely organic. The same here, we used that same process of using visualization, design visualization, to model that in low resolution, and then start working out which parts are going to be CGI and which parts are going to be physical. And the thing that I got quite excited about was that we were working with boat builders in Vancouver, and they were using really traditional practice as they would build a boat. But the ribs here are being cut by CNC machines, which is part of the rapid prototyping process that you're going to learn about a lot more when you listen to Amy Fredine and Alan Gershenfeld later. But this traditional process developed into something using CAD, using computer tools, that was a really organic piece of architecture. Which moves to a completely other scale extreme. This is a recent project, in fact we're still working on it. We had been asked to see if we could create a new language for a pancreatic beta cell. So this is the cell that is responsible for diabetes. So there's a lot at stake in people understanding how to cure diabetes by understanding pancreatic beta cell. The problem is this, that the cell, that single cell is described in this way. So nobody understands what the hell this means. It's a completely complex and very, very esoteric language. So only molecular biologists understand how to interpret this. What they need in order to move their knowledge forward is a common language, a language that everybody can get involved in. So I'll just show you a tiny clip of what this developed into. We had to find a form language, a visual language that could be understood by biologists, by physicists, and by artists all in the same way, by high school students and by nuclear physicists. So this model represents a piece of that complicated diagram that you just saw, but you can see that it's entirely expressed entirely differently. These look like huge buildings, they're part of a city or something like a coral reef, and you can fly through this in VR, and each of these characters is scientifically accurate, but at the same time is kind of expressive, and you can really form relationships with these different characters inside this world. So as I say, we're just starting that.
Part of poverty.
We're just starting that project really. We're a year into it. It's a very long project to make the whole cell as complicated as building a city really. But we kind of now know how to do it, and we've got scientists and artists working together. And it's very exciting to see how the scientists are responding to something that we're treating as a set, really, as a sort of cinematic space. But because it's scientifically accurate, it's really useful to them.
Part of poverty is being reliant on someone. One of the foundational beliefs at Obeva is that all of the work that happens has to come from the population itself. As soon as we started asking them to build, one of the challenges that we had was most of them cannot be considered literate in our own language. We had to rely on a common language. And for us, it was the language of pictures and symbols. We started to come up with this idea of using the virtual space to solve real world problems, able to visualize it in ways never seen before. Poverty is a social construct. It's a design flaw. It is something that we can undo. The future of the way that we interact with one another requires that kind of forethought and that kind of ability to extrapolate and to imagine.
So that's a 10-year vision for a nomadic tribe in Saudi Arabia, in this area called Al-Baida. The real issue here is that it's extreme drought. It rains once every 5 years. And so what's happening alongside the architecture is a sustainability program called permaculture. And they have built a forest of trees, fruit-bearing trees and vegetables that is growing now an acre of land that can bring that world back to life, even though it rains once in every 5 years. So again, it's bringing technology back together with really, ancient cultures. This is a project we did in my class. Makoko is a small village in Nigeria, in Lagos. And the problem we set ourselves was, what if water has been privatized, so that suddenly water is really valuable. And then this very poor fishing village is kind of sitting on a huge resource. It's sea salt, but if they can learn how to desalinate, then this group that we were representing becomes, actually sort of completely changes their situation. They move from poverty to wealth. So we imagined that this floating school, which was built in 2014 and actually floated in Makoko, was the beginning of this story. That each of these characters were students in the school, and 10, 15 years later, as they've grown up, they are all developing different ways to form a relationship with this new world that they're being forced into, where water's been privatized. This represents something that's also a technical challenge, is how do you tell the stories of 6 people simultaneously, and even how do you map it? So this represents one day of these 6 characters as they move through this tiny part of the town. We used the mandala to map it out, but ultimately we used this kind of a linear, of weaving these threads of different stories together, really as a test. And then we put it into VR, and again, very low resolution, but it's a way of testing how you would move through this space, where each of those different story threads is represented by a colored line. And as you move through it, you see images that the students have created to kind of build out what it could look like one day. Also a very recent project, we just worked with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council in Alaska to imagine the future of the indigenous youth across multiple tribes in Alaska. And there's clearly a deep relationship to storytelling. So that this very powerful instrument, it really has been evolving, for 2,000 years. It's an oral history, but things are beginning to change rapidly. So some of those stories really don't relate in the same way, for example, to the ice, to the rapidity of ice melt, how that changes their relationship to hunting. So how do the youth of those tribes start changing their relationship to these stories and use all of the resources of their history, their cultural history, and innovation, but start applying it to the future at this moment of really rapid change. So there's a couple of examples. This relationship, by the way, comes from this game, Never Alone, which again, Alan and Amy are going to talk to you about in detail later. But this is a fantastic game that took the Inupiat tribal stories, one mythology, and turned it into a completely contemporary way of interacting with a deeply mythological story from the history. So we imagined that in 2018, the youth formed an Alaskan youth movement and started networking all of the different tribes, towns, villages, cities in Alaska, created a sort of powerful new framework for developing the future and the language of the future, and starting to take control over their own future. And then we've designed a number of different scenarios. These are all set 10 or 20 years in the future, but they're tapping into what we know now about current innovation. In this case, these drones have been developed as spirit animals that are companions for each of the hunters who are going out on the tundra and onto the ice. And they're forming a relationship, each has their own companion, and those companions help them in the extremely adverse conditions that they're working in. So how do you use these powerhouses of new transformational technology and all of the wisdom and innovation of the tribe to apply to a new future? This is another example where server farms are beginning to be pushed into the Arctic North because they can be cooled naturally, but they still give off a lot of heat. So what if that heat was tapped and pulled into greenhouses, and a new kind of aquaculture, permaculture starts growing, and the food starts to be developed within the community, where right now it has to be flown in at great cost. So we're really looking in this project about how you can take on board your own control of shaping the future, instead of being shaped by it, by the outside forces. But now all of this technology is so accessible that you can actually take hold of the future yourself. So how do we apply that to the real world? We're really deeply invested in this idea that none of this is now entertainment media, none of it's about getting a good box office weekend. This is all about longevity. How do you develop ideas that push into the world and live in the world and start to develop and forming a relationship with all of the people who interact with them? So for example, if one were to take a building that you probably all recognize, that the chief has asked us to start thinking about as a world in itself. How do you start thinking about all of the possibilities that could happen if you embed cultural history into this modern architecture and form a new way of taking control over the future? So I was going to ask my very good friend and amazing architect, Michael Rotundi, to pick up the story from here. Michael? And so we're going to start working together on this architectural world.
One of the things, I've been a teacher as long as I've been a practitioner. And as soon as I graduated from university, I was asked to begin to teach, but I was always interested in making things. I learned how to use my hands before I knew why. So both making of buildings and thinking about buildings were woven together. When I met Alex, I became very, very interested in his method of using stories in a very constructive way that he calls world building. The mandala, which is a round shape, which means circle or sphere, is pretty much as it's been historically used in many, many cultures. It's taking a grand story which is taken apart and told in many different ways by many, many, many people and put together into one shape. Okay? Now, it's easy to keep that all in one shape and to talk about it. In my world, having grown up in a very large immigrant family, being the youngest, everybody was talking at the same time, and they were all telling their version of whatever the story was. Sitting quietly and listening, instead of saying there's a correct version, I started to realize that everybody's version of the story was correct from their point of view. The problem was they didn't know how to negotiate to the middle. And so that's where the conflict arose. And in an Italian immigrant family, the conflict goes on for days. In my world, when I decided I wanted to be an architect, I began to see architecture as conflict resolution. This morning we're listening to the history of stickball and why stickball is played, what it is. I started to immediately see that architecture and stickball have a lot in common, basically. It's about conflict resolution. In the case of an architect working on a building, there's many voices that decide what that building should be. Most of the buildings that we experience are done either as a financial model or a functional model. And we're in one like now. I see a building as a manifestation of many stories. And so the conflict is, how do you take many stories to make one big story, especially at a time when we don't all have a belief system that is one big story? So is it possible to make a hybrid of many stories? And the answer, I believe, is yes. So the project that I've been working on over the years is listening and then turning those stories into architecture. So as a teacher, as you're moving through these buildings, the building begins to prompt the memories that you have, and you're in an immersive space, a physically immersive space, and then those stories begin, your version of those stories, begin to come out, so to speak, of the walls. And then you are so excited about it, usually, especially if I'm doing an educational building, you want to tell those stories to others. And then that becomes the common ground for us to begin to communicate in a peaceful way. It's not to say that there's no, in my family, both kissing and biting were acts of love. So I'm used to the wrestling being important. Conflict, the most fundamental conflict, when I was reading about conflict years ago, as a creative process, rubbing two sticks together is a conflict. What do you get from rubbing two sticks? A campfire. What do you get from a campfire? You get food. So you have to see conflict as a creative process rather than a process of anger. I see it as coming out of joy. Historically, at some point later, historically, when you look at the architecture that was inhabited by indigenous people, they were used as the textbook for teaching. The grandparent or the elder would sit with the child and not only talk about what it is and how you make it, but also what it means. What it means. So it was a full process of going from the most practical things to the most profound things while sitting in a space. And I think that's really it's an exceptional challenge. And I think if it happens anywhere in the United States, what I'm beginning to understand about the Choctaw and how entrepreneurial we are. When I use the word entrepreneurial, it's not just about making money, it's about keeping culture alive and growing the culture. It could happen here. This is a sidebar. I worked in South Dakota with an indigenous group, the Lakota, for 6 years. And what they challenged me to do at that time is to listen to the story coming from the elders and then turn those stories into a master plan for a campus and then buildings for teaching. So the buildings became instruments of teaching, as well as the landscape became an instrument for teaching. So, and what's important, was the final thing, what's important about the story is the three big questions that we ask individually and collectively in all fields. It could be anthropology and it could be astrophysics. Who are we? Why are we here? And where are we going? So the story is local and it's now, but it starts in antiquity and it moves into the future. So by knowing the story from history to the present, it allows you to draw the line into the future. And hopefully that's with confidence, I would say that's what will happen here in short order.
Yeah, I love that idea. That this is a passage, this is a vessel that is in constant motion, really, because it's moving through time in relation to a completely changing flow of people. So we have been thinking about this building as a container for narratives, for multiple narratives. And it's almost like a ship that's moving through time, but it is possible for a real evolution of storytelling to be embedded in it from the past, as Michael says, and be part of this arc through the present to the future.
What I find, you know, it's a harsh word, but offensive, is when one culture comes to another culture and embed their culture in that culture. And when I look at a building like this, it's that. It's basically embedding another world into this world without any deference to the world that it's in. I hope nobody's offended. No, I hope the architect who did this isn't here. If he is, I'm going to hit him. Yeah.
So we're looking 10, 25, sometimes 50 years in the future. And we're doing it with a lot of, as well as institutions and the tribes, but also with corporations. So we're working and have worked with Nike and Boeing and Ford and a lot of corporations who are really finding that they're kind of on shifting ground, that the way that they have run these businesses for the past 100 years really doesn't apply anymore. So what we believe is that you can tell stories, that fiction is actually incredibly powerful. The design fiction that happened in Minority Report has an influence on the real world. When you tell powerful stories, they change the world. And so if we project forward 10 years, 25 years, and we create this vision, we're not following trends so much as we're starting to create a vision of where you would like to go, and then we thread that back into the present. And because we're really interested in systems design and the processes that overlay the stories, or are foundations for the stories, both of those cases, then we can actually apply all of the constraints of the real world that you have now. You can project forward in ways to examine what technology what effect it may have. You can play out all of the possible scenarios using these characters that we develop, using real situations, using the world, and then you can start actually planning your future based on that. So we're finding it's incredibly powerful to pull together this really fictional storytelling practice into something that's completely applicable in the real world.